My name is Daisy. I just turned 18 this year, and I live with my parents in a spacious house in California. My family is well off, never having to worry about food and money. My father is a real estate agent, a man with a rugged appearance but full of courage. And my mother is a gentle, kind teacher who always takes care of the family. Our life seemed to be going on peacefully in that cozy house, until one day, everything suddenly changed. That day was a gloomy afternoon. Dark clouds gathered thickly, as if foretelling something bad. My mother and I were in the kitchen, preparing dinner together as usual, waiting for my father to come home after a long day of work. The kitchen was cozy at that time. The aroma of my mother's soup was spreading, making the atmosphere more gentle amidst the cold wind outside. But that atmosphere was quickly broken when the phone suddenly rang. "It's my dad calling." I stood still as my mother picked up the phone, and in just a few short minutes, everything changed completely. My father's voice was trembling, completely different from his usual confidence. He said that his company had gone bankrupt, that he had no money left to maintain, and that he was forced to sell the house to pay off the debt. Those words were like a thunderbolt that struck my mother and me. Everything we had, including the beloved house we had lived in since childhood, would no longer belong to us. I looked at my mother, and saw that she was trying to stay calm, but her eyes were filled with worry. "Tomorrow you two must quickly move back to the countryside," my father instructed, his voice full of fatigue. "Move back to live with your grandfather, where at least we still have a roof over our heads." My father's words left me in shock. My father's hometown was a place I rarely visited, because since my grandmother passed away, my grandfather had lived alone in an old house. My memories of my grandfather were of the days when I was little, when he often joked with me and pampered me like a treasure. But it's been so long since I've seen him, I can't remember his face clearly anymore. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the familiar house. It was just me and my mother in the small car, and my father had gone somewhere since he called to tell me the bad news. We drove along the long road back to our hometown, the scenery on both sides gradually changing from the bright high-rise buildings to muddy dirt roads and vast fields. The feeling of desolation and silence made my heart heavy. When we arrived, an old house appeared before our eyes. The roof was discolored by time, the peeling walls revealed old bricks. Surrounding it was a large garden, with many fruit trees that had grown green. I got out of the car, feeling a little hesitant before this wild and strange scene. Suddenly the main door of the house creaked open, and I saw my grandfather walking out, thin, slightly hunched. His deep eyes seemed older than what I remembered. He smiled when he saw us, especially me. When I was little, I remember that he always loved and pampered me, but now, there was something strange and indescribable in his eyes. It was no longer the gentleness I used to know, but instead a deeper, more attentive look. However, I didn't think too much of it, simply thinking that it was because he had aged and changed over the years. We greeted my grandfather, and he enthusiastically led us into the house. Inside the house, everything was old, the furniture was simple, but he had prepared everything. He had carefully cleaned and prepared a bed for my mother and me, making me feel his thoughtfulness. Although it wasn't as luxurious as the previous house, it was still warm in a different way. In the early days of living with my grandfather, everything seemed peaceful. He always cared for us, often told stories and helped my mother adapt to the new life. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that my grandfather's eyes became stranger when he looked at me. Every time I stood in front of the mirror combing my hair, or simply sitting in the garden reading a book, I felt like someone was watching me. Every time I turned around, I often caught my grandfather's eyes, but instead of the warmth like when I was a child, it was a mysterious look. I don't know if it was because I was wearing slightly cool clothes that he gave me those looks. In the city, I was used to wearing comfortable, light, simple clothes. But now that I think about it, maybe he wasn't used to this image of me. Maybe because he hadn't seen me for a long time, seeing me like that for the first time he reacted like that. I reassured myself that there was probably nothing to worry about, just the difference in lifestyle between the city and the countryside. Then one day it was a quiet noon. My mother was away, she had to go to town in the morning. Only my grandfather and I were at home. I sat on the old sofa in the living room. The chair had faded over the years but was still very comfortable. In my hand was the book one had finished reading a few days ago. Outside, weak rays of sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating a small corner of the room, making the space dreamy and quiet. I was engrossed in reading, not paying attention to the small noises from behind until my grandfather suddenly walked into the room. He held in his hand a plate of fruit that had been peeled neatly. The apples, pears and oranges were neatly arranged, looking very eye-catching. He slowly approached me, put the plate of fruit on the table and smiled, his voice warm. "You eat, I just prepared it. You have to eat a lot of fruit for good health." I raised my head slightly, smiled and replied, "Thank you, Grandpa." Then I picked up a piece of apple, took a light bite, and turned back to the book in my hand, feeling grateful for his little concern. Grandpa was always so thoughtful. Every gesture of care was very careful. However, I couldn't help but notice that he had sat down on the opposite chair, his eyes fixed on me. At first I thought he just wanted to sit and rest, but then the long silence made me feel embarrassed. He sat there saying nothing, just looking at me. Even though I tried to ignore it, focusing on the book, that look seemed to burn the space between us. After a while he spoke softly, breaking the silence. "You've really grown up. Just the other day I was holding you, and now you've become such a beautiful girl." I raised my face to look at him, forcing a smile. "Yes, time flies so fast, Grandpa," I replied softly, feeling my cheeks starting to heat up. His eyes looked at me differently, not like the eyes of the grandfather I knew when I was little. It was no longer warm and gentle, but something indescribable, making me feel uncomfortable. He continued, his voice low, as if he were contemplating, "The older you get, the more beautiful you become. These eyes, this face, all resemble your mother's when she was young. Very beautiful, but you have your own unique features, no one can compare." I smiled slightly, trying to hide the embarrassment that was rising in my heart. "You flatter me too much. I'm just ordinary," I said, my eyes still glued to the book, trying to appear calm. But inside I felt uncomfortable at all. His compliments made me confused, and I didn't know how to respond properly. He continued, as if he wanted to prolong the conversation. "I used to carry you around the garden. Do you remember? When you were a little girl you kept chattering to me about this and that. And now in just a few years you've become such a beautiful young woman, with such a graceful figure." I smiled lightly, my heart filled with awkwardness. "Yes, I remember. It was so much fun back then. He always spoiled me." He stared at me, not taking his eyes off me. "You're not only beautiful, but also very charming. The boys would surely be crazy about you. I just wish there was someone good enough to take good care of you." I was embarrassed, bowing my head, my hands shaking as I turned the pages of the book, even though I wasn't really reading anything. His words left me unsure of how to react. "You're still young, it's too early to think about that," I replied softly, trying to keep my composure. Grandpa smiled, looked at me for a moment, then stood up. "Yes, you're right. Let me read. I'll go out to the garden for a while with that." He walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there, relieved that the conversation was over. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling as if an invisible burden had been lifted. When he left, I dared to raise my head and look around the room. Everything was quiet again, but there was still something in my heart that was unexplainable. The book in my hand seemed meaningless, because my mind was no longer focused on each line but was dominated by my grandfather's eyes and words. Those compliments, though gentle, contained something that made me unable to stop thinking. After that conversation, everything seemed to become even more difficult to describe. My grandfather's eyes were no longer the warm gaze I used to know. There was something in the way he looked at me that made me unable to be completely comfortable, like before. I tried to ignore it, reassuring myself that I was just thinking too much. But really, every time he was near, I couldn't stop the feeling of anxiety and confusion rising in my heart. Then one morning my mother had to go out again. This time she said she had to go help my father with some important work in the city, so it was just me and my grandfather at home. When I heard my mother say that, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Although I didn't want to admit it, I began to feel something was wrong with my grandfather. It wasn't just his eyes anymore, but sometimes he also had strange actions that I couldn't understand. After my mother left, the atmosphere in the house became strangely quiet. In the past, I would still see him sitting in the living room, or in the garden. Occasionally he would glance at me, but it was just a quick glance. But today he seemed to want to be closer, and that closeness made me feel uneasy. That day was the third day my mother was away. The afternoon passed peacefully, the sunlight slanted through the trees in the garden, creating sparkling spots of light on the ground. I, as usual, had nothing to do but sit under the fruit trees, holding a book in my hand. My grandfather's garden was really beautiful on afternoons like that, with the birds chirping in the distance, the gentle breeze blowing through, making each leaf sway. But today, that peace only made me more nervous, as my mind was filled with an uneasy feeling about my grandfather. I was engrossed in my book, trying not to think about anything else, when suddenly I heard a strange sound coming from behind me. It was gentle, like soft footsteps on soft grass. My heart suddenly beat faster. I slowly turned my head, and as expected, my grandfather was approaching. His steps were slow but sure, his eyes never leaving me. Anxiety filled my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off him, even though I just wanted to stand up and leave immediately. He walked closer, until he was only a few steps away from me. I tried to stay calm, but the tension was evident on my face. "Grandpa," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. He stopped right in front of me, staring at me with a gaze I had never seen before. His voice was deep but unfamiliar. "I like you." Lily, I was stunned. My mind was spinning. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. He continued, his voice even but determined. "In my life, I have never seen a girl as beautiful as you. You are perfect, from your eyes to your skin, to your smile." I stood still, completely confused and not knowing how to react. My heart was pounding. My whole body was frozen. I couldn't take my eyes off him, but I couldn't say a word either. Those words, coming from the mouth of the grandfather I once respected, were like a cold knife cutting into my mind. He stood there, his eyes steady, full of desire, staring at me. I could feel his breath. The closeness took my breath away. "You know," he continued, his voice full of passion, "you have grown up into a beautiful young lady, and I cannot help but notice that." I still couldn't say anything. My feet were glued to the ground. A series of chaotic thoughts rang through my head, but none of them were strong enough to help me escape this situation. I felt like I was stuck in a strange dream, where everything was vague and scary. After a long silence, I finally managed to say a few words. You don't say that." Then he continued to move closer to me, to the point where I could feel his breathing. My heart was pounding, and my feet were glued to the ground. When he stood in front of me, his skinny hand slowly reached up and took my hand. I shivered. The feeling of his rough skin touching me made me tremble. His voice whispered, vague but also heavy, "Lily, do you know? I want you to be mine." He squeezed my hand, and I could see in his eyes, not the affection of a grandfather, but an emotion I never expected. I panicked, trying to pull my hand back but didn't have enough strength. My mind was spinning, trying to find a way to escape this situation. I spoke up, my voice trembling but determined. Grandpa, you shouldn't do that. I'm your grandchild. I can't." He looked at me, his face surprised and somewhat disappointed. "But do you know, I've been thinking about this for a long time. You've grown up, become a beautiful woman. I just want to be with you, protect you, love you like I've never loved anyone before." I took a step back, my hands still shaking. "Grandpa, I can't. I'm your granddaughter. We can't be like this. Please stop." He fell silent now, his eyes shifting from longing to a distant sadness. He slowly let go of my hand and stepped back. He bowed his head, his voice drowning in guilt. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what happened to me." He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with regret, then quietly turned and walked away. His figure slowly disappeared behind the trees in the garden. I stood still in place, unable to move or say anything. My heart was still beating fast, fear still echoing in every breath. When he was gone, I dared to breathe a sigh of relief, as if I had just been freed from a nightmare. From that day on, I no longer dared to face him. Every time he appeared in my sight, I tried to avoid him. I felt confused and scared, not knowing what to do, nor whether I should tell my mother. But I also felt the distance between me and him growing bigger and bigger, and in my heart there was only worry. Fortunately, not long after, my parents returned. That day, my mother walked into the house with a gentle smile. She said that everything in the city had been resolved, my father's work had stabilized again, and we could return home. I looked at my mother, my heart filled with an indescribable sense of relief. Everything seemed to have been lifted. I no longer had to be afraid when I was near him. My father returned shortly after, smiling brightly, and saying that everything was back to normal. The whole family prepared to leave my grandfather's house and return to the city. I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. I would never forget those days, the days when everything from my grandfather's eyes to his actions had changed our relationship forever. But now, as I got into the car and sat next to my mother, I felt safe and grateful that everything was finally over. As we were getting into the car, I accidentally caught my grandfather's eyes. It was a sad, deep gaze, as if he was trying to say something but couldn't get the words out. But he didn't dare look me straight in the eye. He just stood there, a little distance away, quietly observing. And I, too, didn't have the courage to face him after everything that had happened. I had so many mixed emotions inside me: fear, worry, but also a little sympathy for him. I knew that, even though he was wrong, he probably felt regretful. Still, I couldn't forget those tense moments. Everything was so sudden, so confusing, that the relationship between him and I was no longer the same. We both needed time, both me and him. Time to calm down, to heal the emotional wounds, and perhaps to heal this relationship if it could ever be the same again. The car started, the sound of the engine breaking the silence of the garden. I looked out the window, at my grandfather again. He stood there, alone in the middle of the large yard, his silver hair gently swaying in the wind. I could feel the loneliness surrounding him. He had lived alone here for so long, and now he had to return to that silence once more, as we left, leaving him alone. I sighed, feeling guilty and sad. No matter what, he was still my relative, the grandfather I once loved and respected. But now, there was a distance between us that neither of us knew how to overcome. The car rolled, gradually leaving that old house. I turned my head to look ahead, trying to push away the chaotic emotions in my heart. On the way back, I didn't say a word. Mom sat next to me, smiling at me and gently asking about the past few days, but I only answered hastily, then silently looked out the window. The scenery on both sides of the road passed by, but in my mind, there was only the image of my grandfather, standing silently in the garden, his eyes sad and unforgettable. After my story, I would like to advise everyone to always respect and maintain boundaries in relationships, even with loved ones. Although family affection is important, respect and personal boundaries must always be maintained. When something makes you feel uncomfortable, be brave enough to speak up. Silence can make the situation more complicated and cause long-term damage. The most important lesson I learned is to listen to your feelings and not let anyone cross your personal boundaries. If you feel insecure, seek help from people you trust. Always protect yourself and keep family or social relationships based on mutual respect.